there's two big things to talk about, obviously, which we can, which I would like to cover. First of all, is just the situation in Israel with regard to Corona and COVID and the COVID situation, and then also the political situation. So, for us, I mean, I always like to start personal and then move out from there. So for those of you that don't know, I live in a town called Zichron Yaakov. It's one of the 5 original towns that were founded in Israel in the first Aliyah, in the late 1800s, and by the Rothschild family. And so it's a well-established town. It's about 22 to 25,000 people in our town. And, we've been in full quarantine for the last month. We're going on a full month of quarantine here. And so, obviously, what does that mean in terms of day-to-day life? That means we, get our groceries delivered. Everything gets delivered. We haven't seen another, or seen another family, or at least hung out with another family in quite some time. Thankfully, we live next to a big nature reserve at the bottom of our street, which is about 300 meters away. So every day we're in the nature reserve, with the kids, and that's good. I have 3 kids here, 6, 8, and 10. We are, doing basically virtual learning. What happened in Israel is because things happen. You remember, in Israel, there's no private school and public school. A large majority of the schooling in Israel is public school, because all the schools here certainly are Jewish in the Jewish community. And so things happen so quickly. They tried virtual learning for a week here in Israel, and then they realized that it wasn't going well. For us, it actually was going well, but for a lot of families, it wasn't going well. Because every kid, if you have 2, 3, 4 kids in a house, every kid needs a computer and a screen, and you need to be sort of prepared for these things. And the Ministry of Education wasn't as prepared. And so after a week of doing virtual learning, where the teachers were, having classes with the kids and giving assignments, they called that off. And so for the last 3 weeks, we've been sort of homeschooling our kids on our own. Which has been interesting. And now on Sunday, now that the Pesach break is over, we've been told that the kids are going to start, formal, virtual learning again on Zoom, and given assignments and so forth, and tests and so forth. So it sounds like they've caught up and might be more prepared for it. There's lots of rumors here. Obviously, Israel is small, and 80% of people are Jewish, so the rumor mill runs wild. There's lots of rumors here that how they're going to make up for the school year, and if for the time missed, and if the kids are going to be, the summer vacation is going to be cut short, and all that stuff will play out over the next couple of weeks. Overall, I can tell you that I think Israel, by and large, weathered or is weathering this storm fairly well, I have to say. And to be very personal and honest with you, we still have a home in San Diego that is sitting there, anytime we need it. And my wife's parents were actually visiting us for the first 3 weeks of this. And they decided to fly back. United, I guess, or whatever airline they were flying, informed them that they were halting all flights to Israel. So they had to fly back to the States because they didn't want to be here. They're older, obviously, and they didn't want to be here not knowing how things would play out here. And so they wanted to go back to Texas, where they were from. And, we had an interesting moment as a family where we said, they said to us, why don't you just fly back to the States, and ride this thing out there. And, we said to them, listen, this is our home. This is where we live. And this is where our community is, and our immediate support system. So we just, it wasn't even consideration for us to get in a plane and go back to the States. not knowing when we would be able to come back here or not. So we didn't do it, but it's definitely a new experience for us after making Aliyah of being cut off. Everyone's isolated. Everyone is isolated. We're here. You guys are there. You guys can't come here, or it's very difficult to come here, and it's almost impossible for us to leave. Obviously, there's a lot of concern for my parents that live in San Diego and my brother and sister and so forth. So it was definitely, when you move here, you think about your kids going to the army, and God forbid there's a war, and there'll be a period of time where you won't be able to get out, but you don't quite contemplate things like this. So it has been an interesting experience, sort of coming to terms with where we are. And I have to say, so far, everyone has been amazing here. They really have. There's a lot of support. The WhatsApp groups are crazy and so forth. And, the amount of WhatsApp groups there are here are just ridiculous. And the country seems to be weathering it very well. So, that's our personal situation. As a country, to move out from there, there have been several waves of tightening of the restrictions here. I think Israel's been acknowledged, and Netanyahu deserves some credit for taking action early and strongly, to especially, someone like Prime Minister Netanyahu, whose sort of bread and butter has been the vibrant economy of Israel, and it's certainly been a source of tremendous accomplishment and pride for this prime minister, for him to make a decision to shut down the economy, which he has done. Well, I think everyone understood that if he's making that decision, it's a big one. Politics can play a role in a lot of things, but past a certain point, it's not gonna play a role. And to shut down the economy for this was a big deal. So he took decisive action early. And I don't know if everyone's read it, but Forbes magazine came out with a deep dive into the data, and I can put it in the chat here on the Zoom. But they analyzed all the data coming out of all the countries in the world, and in terms of prevention and treatments and hospitalization and everything. And if you can believe it or not, Israel came out number one in the world of their response to the corona situation. And so I think that definitely sort of validated a lot of things that have been going on. To let you know just sort of how strict the restrictions got here. I mean, we live in a smaller town where everyone is basically, staying inside or staying within, proximity to their home. But the first wave of restrictions was no one goes out of their home for more than 100 meters. And because a lot of people, especially in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, were exercising, getting out with their kids. If you live with kids in a small apartment, it's very, very difficult to be in that apartment for so long. And then, there was a second wave of restrictions that really basically locked the entire country down for periods of time, that no one could even sort of leave their house. And those revolved around the Seder night and now the end of Pesach. And I think that was a response to one of the things that facilitated the early spreading of the virus here was Purim. Everyone got together for Purim, and in retrospect, that was one of the things that caused the spread early on. And so the government wanted to make sure that Pesach didn't cause a reemergence of this. So they very much clamped down on the restrictions here, to the point where there were roadblocks coming in and out of my town, Zichron. You had to prove that you lived there in order to go there. They banned all intercity travel, so no one could get in and out of their towns, let alone leave their houses. There were thousands of citations given for people that were over 100 meters from their house. And and literally the country was shut down for periods of time. The roads were pretty much empty. I don't want to say it was exactly like Yom Kippur, because Yom Kippur, I mean, there is a sacred rule that no one is on the roads, but it was close to Yom Kippur, where it was eerie. It was definitely eerie. But it seems to have paid off, and I think the last day that was reported, there were 100 new infections, which is relatively low. And basically what there is now, the challenge now for the country here is dealing with communities that are cut off. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Communities that are not on Zoom, that are not on the internet that as much, that are not as engaged with the news. And basically that's the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab community. And so in Israel here, the challenge is right now the biggest spread of the virus is in Jerusalem and in ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods, because ultra-Orthodox really limit how they get their news. And so B'nai Brak is been talked about a lot here. It's a very, very ultra-Orthodox neighborhood of Tel Aviv. And so there were restrictions there the last couple of days, where it was basically a restricted zone. No one could go in and come out. And, now you start to get into a lot of political matters here about ultra-Orthodox being singled out for restrictions and so forth. And so, and now the Arab community here as well, because testing wasn't done as extensively in the Arab community as it was everywhere else. So now testing is being ramped up in the Arab community, and they're finding clusters of coronavirus there. But overall, the country is stable, is moving forward. People here are a lot more used to adversity and have been through this before. Not obviously a virus, but have been through, missiles from Iraq and wars and so forth. And so adversity is kind of in the DNA here, which has made it, I think, easier to manage. And also the country is technologically advanced and small, so you're able to make quick decisions and implement those decisions quickly. In the States, you have 50 states with a federal government, and you're seeing a tough time, with those people that are making decisions and implementing them. In Israel, it's different. You've got a population of 9 million. That's really 80% of it's concentrated between Haifa and Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Tel Aviv. And so you're able to implement these changes and restrictions and adapt more quickly. So it's certainly helped the country. And I think the outlook, I think for Israel and the rest of the world is, for the rest of this year, it's going to be stop-start. It's going to be easing restrictions, seeing what happens, the rate of infection goes up, and then putting them in place, putting more restrictions in place. They're talking about here, targeting those restrictions to certain neighborhoods. Like there's several neighborhoods in Jerusalem that now are under heavier restrictions than the rest of the country. And I can say just from today, I already feel like the country is starting to slowly open up more. Just a anecdotal thing, there's an empty tennis court that I take my kids to every day to ride bikes and to, play soccer and stuff like that. And for the first time, since this has happened, there were tennis lessons being held on the other two courts. There was a tennis coach giving lessons. So, things have been very tightly locked down for a while. And I think what you're going to see is in the next couple of weeks, things slowly start to ease up here. I can tell you that from a corona standpoint, I've consistently found that Israel was about 10 to 12 days in front of what's happening in the States. When I speak to my friends and family in the States, about what they're going through and about what I've gone through, I felt like we're about, sort of, a week to 2 weeks ahead of what the States is going through. And so I think we can expect, a lot of ups and downs for the rest of this year. Please God, some treatments that are coming online. There's a tremendous amount of money and manpower being invested in a vaccine, including in Israel. Israel is playing a huge role on the forefront of treatments and vaccines. Another small story today that came out was, there's an elite unit of the Army here, the technology unit that has adapted some of the widely used existing medical machines to be ventilators at a fraction of the cost. And they delivered the first 100 of those machines to the hospitals throughout Israel for them to start using. So the country is, you're seeing in all its glory, its full adaptability and flexibility and creativity, when it combats this. Are all the decisions perfect? 100% not, 100% not. Are there going to be more mistakes in the next coming weeks? Because there's so much pressure to open up the economy. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of pressure to open up the economy, and there'll be mistakes. But, overall, I have to say that, the country has responded well, and people here, overall has taken it fairly seriously and have changed their way of life. How quickly the economic, the unemployment rate is now above 25% in Israel, which is a huge number. How quickly that's going to come down will be the big question that's everyone asking. Will it be a big bounce, or will it be a small bounce? Will it be 5-year depression? Will it be a 12 to 18-month recovery? All those questions will be asked and will be answered in due course. But I think Israel being such a technologically driven economy, not manufacturing or factory workers or stuff like that, I suspect that the country will bounce back, quicker than a lot of others. It's a very technologically service-oriented country. Is it going to be, back to where it was before, in the next 12 to 18 months? Absolutely not. There's no way. We shouldn't kid ourselves. I mean, we were in the midst of one of the biggest economic booms of our lifetime, and that came to an end almost instantly. So it's not going to be back to the way it was, but is it going to be back to 75% or 80% the way it was? Yeah, I do think this economy will endure this and do well. But we'll see. There's still a lot to play out. At this point, just to make sure that I got everyone's attention, I just want to see if there's anyone has questions. I got the chat up here. I can see all your comments. I'm happy to answer any questions before we move on to the political stuff. But I can't. I would imagine there's a bunch of questions on COVID and what's happening here. But I'll give everyone a second to let me know if there are.
If anyone is trying to talk but doesn't know how to unmute themselves, just send a chat and I will help you out with that. Or raise your hand.
Oh, raise your hand's a good idea. Fran looks like she's trying to type a question. For those of you that want to know, in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen of Zoom, there's a button called mute, and you could just click that and unmute yourself, and you will be able to either ask a question.
Yeah.
I've unmuted myself. Hi, it's Bonnie Graff, and I do have a question. I read online that the Jerusalem Post said that Israel was 2 weeks away from a breakthrough on a vaccine, which then, of course, goes through all the other processes. And I don't have any verification of that. Can you speak to that?
Sure. I mean, I can speak to it, but you should know that, one, I'm not a doctor or a medical professional. I'm reading, just, the same stuff you are, and I mean, as much as I can. But, from what I can gather, I think we need to temper our expectations of a vaccine. A vaccine being developed and a vaccine being proven are two different things, right? So from what I can understand, there is a massive race across the world to develop a vaccine, right? But there's tremendous risk in a vaccine, right? If you develop, the scientific community is putting itself at huge risk if it deploys a vaccine that has terrible side effects. This is a vaccine that's going to be deployed worldwide to all of us on this call, including myself. And if you're going to produce, 1 billion vaccines, you got to make sure it's safe. So it's one thing proving a vaccine is safe, and it's another thing developing a safe vaccine. From everything that I've read, and including an article today where I'm sure have read it, Johnson & Johnson is working on a vaccine, and they're going to develop 500 million doses by early 2021. From everything that I've read, the earliest possible time a vaccine could be available is at the end of this year. And by available, meaning available for all of us on this call to take it, safely, where it's been proven safely. Remember, it's a huge liability for any company to produce 1 billion doses of a vaccine that's not safe. It's like shooting yourself in the head, and none of us want to take an unproven vaccine either. So it just simply takes time, but these medical companies and startups that are out there, that's the only news that I'm consuming. And we should talk about that, as well. But the only news that I'm really consuming heavily is on the treatment and vaccine front. And from everything that I've read, I think it's just not going to happen till the end of this year, which basically, what is going to bridge the gap between now, April 16th and the end of this year is treatments, and so there is a tremendous amount of work on treatments to treat people more effectively that get corona. And so, there will be advances, and there are already advances. The amount of learning and knowledge and data that comes in every day from the situation is astronomical. And so this is all being used to develop effective treatments. And so treatments will be developed in the next, hopefully, 60, 90 days that will bridge the gap between now and a vaccine, that will give us some security and comfort that we can, start to slowly resume our normal lives. But I think we all need to be realistic with ourselves that the end of this year, early next year, there'll be a widely distributed vaccine. And there seems to be a lot of confidence around that timeline, I will say. It's not, for these companies to exude this amount of confidence. As a business person, I know, because you always have to manage expectations, but for them to exude this confidence that a vaccine will be developed is unusual. And so I do feel that this is not something abstract. This is something that will be real, but it takes time till the end of this year. Michael and Joanne is raising their hand.
Yeah, I'd like to know, what's Israel doing about the Palestinian situation in the West Bank? Are they preventing them from coming into Israel, or what's happening to them? And what's the situation with the cases of COVID?
Yeah, so this is a good transition. That's a great question. So, one thing that this is, the Middle East, I would say, was kind of red hot before this. Red hot in terms of, instability and confrontation. Israel was covertly, attacking targets in, Lebanon and Syria, and not acknowledging it, and even by some reports in Iraq, the Saudis were at war with the Iranian-backed rebels in Yemen. Iran was causing havoc in the region. Throughout the region. And so, the one interesting thing that everyone has been paying attention to is that this is kind of the great equalizer. It doesn't matter the borders, ethnicity, religion, or anything. We're all in this together, and so it's kind of caused a kind of virtual ceasefire throughout the region. And so we've seen some of these real things symbolize that. The main thing is that Iran seems to be, I think the big story that will come out of this is that Iran is one of the most heavily affected countries in the world with COVID. The numbers that they're reporting are ridiculously understated and lies, as is pretty typical with authoritarian regimes. So I think, you know, you can add a multiple of 10 or, you know, a 0 or 2 zeros to whatever numbers that they are reporting. I think they reported approximately 5,000 deaths in Iran. So you can assume that at a minimum there's 10,000, probably much, much more. And, you know, remember that the country domestically of Iran was not in the strongest possible shape before. The economy was a wreck, and the sanctions that Trump put on them were working. And so they weren't in a strong position before. And so this has weakened them even more. And there's a byproduct of it's curtailed some of their activity throughout the Middle East. And so this virus is kind of thrown sand on a fire. You know, two other examples before I get to your question about the Palestinians. Two other examples that are good examples of this are, there's now a ceasefire between Saudi Arabia and the Iranian-backed militia in Yemen, and that was a vicious war. That is a vicious war. You know, those Houthi rebels in Yemen have fired missiles at the airport in Riyadh. I mean, you know, routinely have fired missiles into Saudi Arabia. So that has been a vicious war. Saudi Arabia has responded, and lots of people have died. And now this virus has basically said, okay, let's cause a ceasefire. Another thing here, another prime example that we're following closely in Israel is there appears to be a lot of momentum and goodwill and timing for a prisoner exchange with Hamas. So Hamas has 2 Israeli citizens that they have in captivity, and they also have the remains of 2 Jewish Israeli soldiers from the last war that Israel has been determined to get back and repatriated back to Israel for their families and for the country. And there've been, you know, interactions and discussions over the last several years that are on again, off again, but this virus has created an opportunity where Gaza needs to, and Hamas in Gaza needs to focus on their own population. They want something from Israel, whether it's, you know, political capital or ventilators or whatever it is. You know, Hamas came out and said, you guys aren't gonna weather the storm and keep all the ventilators and, you know, peacefully unless you send some of them to us. And so, you know, this has gotten, you know, the virus has impacted things politically. And there was even an article today saying that there are very, very serious discussions to get these 2 Israeli citizens that are being held in Gaza, and the remains of the 2 Jewish Israeli soldiers repatriated. And there are very serious discussions going on about that. So the virus itself is changing the political equation in the region and creating some opportunities. With regard to the Palestinians, I think it's safe to say that Israel's largest concern is that this virus wreaks havoc in the Palestinian territories. You know, this virus does not care about borders. You know, there are still everyday Palestinians that come and work in Israel, even now. And there are, so, and even if they weren't, you could still get into Israel. No border is watertight. And so, you know, we're all in this together. And so there has been extraordinary cooperation between the Palestinians and the Israelis to try and combat this virus, because it doesn't matter what the political situation is, or it doesn't matter how quickly Israel recovers from this virus. If the Palestinians who are 3.5 or whatever, 4 million of them in the midst of Israel, if it runs wild in the Palestinian community, it's going to affect Israel negatively. So there's been tremendous cooperation to the point where I think the UN Secretary General actually commented on it and said the cooperation between the Israelis and Palestinians are unprecedented. And, I'm sure, listen, the way these things work is everyone works together and the goodwill is sky high in the beginning. And then over time, the goodwill starts to fade and the politics starts to return to it. So I have no doubt that it's going to be messy with the Palestinians, but there is definitely a realization that, whatever happens, we're all in this together. And if the Palestinians go down with this virus, it's going to take Israel down too, and vice versa. What are the good aspects of it? Unlike Europe that has completely open borders, or the US that kind of, had open borders with Canada and Mexico, Israel is isolated, which is working to our advantage. We're sealed. The border with Lebanon sealed, the border with Egypt is sealed. There's the fence with the Palestinians, so that can contain it. The border with Jordan is sealed. And so, there's not as much movement as you're seeing in Europe, where people can, still travel freely. And so that will help us contain things. But there's no doubt that, the Israelis and the Palestinians will have to continue to work together and make sure that, this is contained. There's absolutely no doubt. And, fortunately, Israel has a strong medical system. They have capacity. They're ready for this. And I suspect that you'll see Israel have to take on some of the responsibility for, for the Palestinians that are getting sick in the coming months, for sure, because it's in everyone's interest to contain this. It's not a political situation. Any other questions before we move on to politics? Hang on, let me go to the next screen and see if anyone's raising their hand or waving frantically. No. Okay, so I'm going to move off Corona. Is everyone good with that? Any other questions here? Okay. So the political situation. I would say that the accurate term for the political situation here is a disaster. But it's certainly not without help or hope. So basically I voted in 3 elections in the last, 2 years, and so we are on our 3rd election that I just voted in. Basically, plus minus, the elections have yielded close to the same results. Sometimes in the last election, Likud and Netanyahu was the largest party. In the elections previous to that, Benny Gantz, who's the ex-chief of staff of the army, his party was the largest. But it really doesn't matter which party is the largest. It matters which party is able to assemble a coalition to form a government. And in this country, there's 120 seats in the Knesset. However many votes you get proportionally, you get allocated those amount of seats in the Knesset. So just for simplification's sake, if there were 100 seats in the Knesset and you got 50%, your party got 50% of the vote, you would get 50 seats in the Knesset. And you now have to form a majority of 61 or more. So it's great that you won half of the votes and 50% of the Knesset, but unless you can convince someone else that has 11 seats to come over and join your coalition, you don't have a government. So it doesn't matter that you won the last election. And so this is what's happened in Israel the last 3 times. Someone has won the election by some degree, but they have not been able to form a government. And Israel is as divided as the states. The country is divided almost down the middle. There are right-wing parties, there are center parties, and there are left-wing parties. Included in the left-wing parties are the Arab parties. you know, because Israel's a democracy, is not an apartheid. The Arabs have a full vote that counts just as much as a Jewish vote. And they have, obviously, they're actually, quite honestly, throughout these elections, have grown in power. And they have quite a bit, they have quite a large party in Israel. And so the situation in the last election was Benny Gantz did not win the election. He didn't get the most seats, but he had the most support to form a coalition. So what happens in Israel is, if you want to get technical, there are elections. The results are tallied. Everyone then has to line up and go meet with the president of Israel, Ruby Rivlin, and tell them who they are recommending to be the prime minister of Israel. And even though Bibi Netanyahu did not got the most seats in the last election, there were 61 or more people that came to the president and said, "I'm recommending Benny Gantz form the next government." So Bibi Netanyahu got the most votes in the last election, but Benny Gantz got the most recommendations from all the other parties to form the government. And he has 2 weeks to form the government. And that 2 weeks was up at midnight last night. And the logical conclusion in this environment is that there would be what's called a unity government, which means the party that got the most votes would team together with the party that got the second most votes, which is usually from the other end of the political spectrum, and they would form a unity government, and they would run the country. They would acknowledge that the country is too divided for one party to form a government, and they would run the country. And you remember, this is the third election that we've had here. So they were unity government negotiations after the last elections that the sides could not agree on everything. And they broke up and they didn't form a government. And so the president then called for new elections. So what happened is that Bibi Netanyahu and Benny Gantz have been negotiating for the last week. There's been, I would say, differences of opinion in Benny Gantz's party to the point where his party is actually split into two. So he won, I can't remember off the top of my head, 32 seats, I think maybe, or 33 seats in the last election. But his party, there were people in his party that didn't agree that he should even negotiate with Bibi Netanyahu to enter a unity government. And so his party split into two. So Benny Gantz now leads a party of 17 versus 32. It doesn't matter. Benny Gantz could lead a party of 7. Bibi Netanyahu is 2 seats short of forming that majority. He's at 59 votes. So he needs 2 more seats to form a government, and there's no one that will join him to form that government. The Arabs won't join him. Benny Gantz's ex-partners won't join him. Labor won't join him. And Benny Gantz is the only man at 17 seats that can put him over this magical number of 61 to form a government. And he can't do it. And so what's happening is everyone is playing, brinksmanship, and Ruby Rivlin has basically given everyone 14 more days, where he's, the way the law works in Israel is if Benny Gantz can't form a government, he can either assign it to someone else to form a government, or he can just give the Knesset itself 14 days to have one vote to say who is going to be prime minister of this country. And that's where we're at. If at the end of 14 days from midnight last night, Benny Gantz and Bibi Netanyahu cannot come to an agreement on a unity government, there will be new elections probably in July or August this year in Israel. And that will be the 4th elections in this country. And if you think about it, the prevailing thought here is that you don't want to be the person perceived to be responsible as causing the 4th elections in this time in Israel's history. The economy is sinking. The government, there's 25% unemployment. You're still going to be dealing with Corona in the summer to a lesser extent, but you'll still be dealing with it. So this is a game of brinksmanship here that's playing out in Israel. And, there's ultimate negotiations going on. The main points of disagreement, quite honestly, are not around how to deal with Corona. They're not around the economy. They're not around social issues. They're around the justice system. Bibi Netanyahu is trying to, finds it very important to fundamentally change the makeup of the Supreme Court and the judges here because he feels that they're out to get them, quite honestly, with these legal problems. So who decides the next Supreme Court justices? Who decides the judges? Who's going to get the Ministry of Justice portfolio? These are the big sticking points between the two sides. And obviously, if you're on the right, you would say, listen, the Supreme Court and the judicial branch has gotten way too much power. They've passed these decisions that have been ridiculous, that have compromised the prime minister. And if you're in the center, or if you're on the left, you're saying Bibi Netanyahu is just trying to stay out of jail, and that's why he's wants to maintain control over the Justice Department and the judges here. Who knows what will happen? If I had to put a number on it, I would say it's 50-50 whether there'll be new elections or a unity government. I think new elections in this time of uncertainty would be a tremendous risk. There's so much uncertainty out there. Who knows what's going to happen in new elections? And nothing is guaranteed. The polls came out that says Bibi Netanyahu is going to clean up and do amazing in the next elections. He's going to win 40 seats in the next elections. And who knows? A lot of things can change in the next couple months. There's going to be a lot of armchair quarterbacking in the next couple months saying, we should have done this, we should have done that, we did this too late or whatnot. So it's going to get real messy politically in the US and Israel in the next couple months. So I think that a new election is a huge risk for everyone. But we'll see. We'll see. Are there any questions here at this point just about the political situation or even about the Jewish community? I see a hand. Hang on one second. I see a hand from Yvonne. So Yvonne, you got to unmute yourself there. You got to unmute yourself.
Oh, there it is. Okay. I'm out. I thought that I read just weeks ago, and it could be before this 2-week period that you're mentioning, that they had agreed to a unity government, 18 months premiership for each one of them, Netanyahu to begin, and then who knows if he would hand it over to Gantz afterwards. That was the plan.
You're right. That was the reports and the plan. And then if you ask Benny Gantz, he would say that Bibi Netanyahu backed out and is doing the same thing he always does, and is riding this to the end to make sure he gets as much concessions as he can. If you ask Bibi Netanyahu, he'd say, listen, I just can't get my right-wing partners. You remember, Bibi's got to convince all these other parties to sign off on this, so he will say, I just can't get them to sign off on it. So there was a deal, or at least there was a reported deal. But I have to tell you, you have to take all these reports in the newspaper with a grain of salt. Until it's done, it's not done.
Right.
And it's all just spin. And, everyone's trying to play everyone's perception.
Yeah.
So,
I have another question regarding that.
Sure.
With 17 seats, is Benny Gantz still the second largest party?
Yes, he is the second largest party. He's former, his former partners, Yair Lapid and Boogie Ayalon, who was the ex-Minister of Defense and Chief of Staff. They have taken the position that it's completely unacceptable even to negotiate with Bibi Netanyahu. Not Likud, but with Bibi Netanyahu.
Yeah, well, I
Uh,
understand that.
they would
Yeah.
enter a government with Likud if it was headed by someone else. But they view Bibi Netanyahu as corrupt, and they've taken the stand that there's no justification to enter into a government with someone that's under indictment. And Benny Gantz has taken a more practical stance, saying, listen, we don't have that luxury. The country needs a government. If I can protect the judicial system and get a government, and you know, remember, the biggest thing that's on the horizon for this country, and every country, by the way, and no one's really talking about this, is the next budget that every country passes. The next budget that every country passes is going to be absolutely brutal. It's going to be brutal on society because there's so much money being put out now in terms of stimulus by every government. And the economies are contracting so much, it simply won't be enough budget to go around. And there will need to be cuts. And so you can imagine in Israel, you know, that, you know, the religious and the secular and high tech and the Arabs and the poverty and the inequality gap, the budget debates that are going to come down the pipeline are going to be brutal in every country. And here in Israel, they passed a law which is actually quite practical, saying you have to pass a budget every 2 years, because to pass a budget every year creates just deadlock, right? And so you pass a 2-year budget here. And so, you know, the budget discussion is going to be brutal. And that's a reason alone for a government, right? I mean, you need a budget. Right now, the situation in Israel, if you don't have a formal budget, you are constricted to the spending limits of the last budget. So right now, the country, even though it's shut down and losing a lot of money, from a government spending standpoint, they are still spending, they're required to only spend to the levels of 2 years ago. So the country's grown a lot in 2 years. So the spending is down now. You cannot spend at these new higher levels because there's no budget. And so at some point, the country needs a budget that's going to need to address the problems that have been created by this. And so Benny Gantz has taken a more practical approach, and he said, we need to join the government. This country needs a government. We need to protect the judicial system. We need a budget. We can't afford another election. He said, I don't believe we can afford another election. And that's why he chose to break away from his previous two partners. But yeah, they are the second biggest party. His former partners will be the opposition, because they'll be the third largest. And then very close after that will be the Arab Party. Remember, you need to think about this scenario. If Benny Gantz and his partners would have joined into a unity government with Bibi Netanyahu, the opposition party would have been the Arab Party. And the Arab, by being in opposition, you have some power.
You have a lot of power.
Yeah. So it's an interesting time, to say the least. Interesting time. Any other questions that are on here that anyone would like to ask? If you can wave your hand or unmute yourself and talk, that'd be great. No other questions?
Well, if no one else has a question, I didn't want to hug all the time. Is there any talk in Israel about term limits? I mean, let me tell you, I'm also Israeli, I'm also South African, so we have similar backgrounds.
Right.
I speak to my Israeli friends a lot. And the one thing, even people who can't stand Netanyahu give him a lot of kudos for how he's handled the coronavirus. So if anything, he's going to get more votes rather than less. But most of my friends in Israel are against him. So my question is, how long? It's way more than 10 years that he's been in power. I can't remember what the number is. I'm sure you know.
Bibi Netanyahu is the longest serving prime minister of Israel.
But
if
how
you add
long?
up his total time. I believe it's close to 10 years. I'm not entirely sure.
So
But,
are they talking about term limits?
No. At this stage, that's a luxury. I mean, obviously, everyone acknowledges that there is time. There should be term limits. But listen, I'll full disclosure. I'm not a supporter of Bibi Netanyahu, but I'm also not one of these guys that thinks everything that he does is terrible. I mean, I'll never vote for him, and I will give him credit for, it's not an easy job, and he's shown a lot of leadership. And I have to say that as an American living in Israel, there's a very strong contrast between, how America is dealing with this and how Israel is dealing with this. And I think Bibi has shown a lot of great leadership.
Right. Yeah, I agree with
to say
you.
that because I will never vote for the guy.
Right.
I don't support him.
Right. No, I
But you
agree.
have to give credit where credit is due. You have to give credit where credit is due. But at this point, there needs to be a government. We need to move past Corona. And I think that Bibi Netanyahu is such a political genius, which he is without question. I mean, without question, that the country will need to move past him. At some point, he will not be prime minister, and the country will still be here, and we'll all be fine. And then I suspect, but as long as he's the prime minister, why would you can't get term limits passed when it's basically contrary to his interests, his personal interests. They've talked about term limits being passed that would start after Netanyahu, to protect, give him some protection. Yeah. But at this point, I think there's so many other issues. Not that that's not important, but there's so many other issues. We just need a government.
Absolutely.
Any other questions before we, I only have one or two more things to talk about, but I'm happy to answer as many questions.
I have a question I can ask.
Oh, yeah.
I'm Jeremy. Can you talk a little bit about where Israel sees itself among the proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia? Are they just going to let it happen and not be involved, or do they have any sort of interest in exerting the influence on that region?
No, I think that, listen, the before the whole Corona situation, it was very clear that there was this massive Sunni Shia confrontation in the Middle East, with the Shia being led by Iran and the Sunni confrontation being led by Saudi Arabia. So the confrontation between Saudi Arabia and Iran and all the people that support Saudi Arabia, who are the major Sunni states that support Saudi Arabia? Obviously Egypt, Yemen to the south, a large part of Iraq, even though not all of it. Even the Palestinians are Sunni. It is one of the great confrontations in the Middle East. And the fact that, Iran is so overtly confronting Saudi Arabia and vice versa. I mean, there's open warfare in everywhere from Iraq to Yemen to everywhere. I mean, again, Riyadh has seen missiles fall down on it from Yemen as a result of Iran. So you've got this very, very strong alignments of interest that all of a sudden, if you look at the major threats that face Israel, which is really Iran, and everything that they're doing through Hezbollah and Syria, and even Gaza and Hamas, all those threats are being supported and empowered and funded to some degree by Iran. Those are the exact same threats that Saudi Arabia is facing. And so you have this historic alignments of interest between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And Bibi very much likes to point out that there is unprecedented cooperation in the Arab world between Israel and the Arab world. And really who he's talking about is Saudi Arabia. And you've seen kind of glimpses of this where you've seen Saudi members of the royal family, members of the government meet with Israeli officials in New York. You've also seen Israeli ministers fly over and participate in conferences in Saudi Arabia. So there's no doubt been a massive convergence of interests and cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Israel. The question is, how open and public can this be? There's no question that it exists, but the question is, how open and public can it be? And the reason why it can't be blown into the full public arena is because of the Palestinian issue. If Saudi Arabia, metaphorically embraces Israel economically versus, meaning buys weapons or, high-tech investments or whatnot, they're going to be pinned with selling out the Palestinians. And, how can you do this to your Palestinian brothers? And they have to worry about the street. And so the lack of resolution on the Palestinian issue, or the lack of status quo of the Palestinian issue, has sort of prevented Saudi Arabia from blowing this into the open. But make no doubt about it, there are security, financial, and technology cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Overt, meaning, ministers, government, technology, industry, and so forth. There is a very, very, very strong convergence of interest. And on top of it, now, MBS, the new leader of Saudi Arabia, he's a young man. He's not part of the old school generation. He's wants to move the country forward. He's made a lot of reforms there. I believe it or not, randomly, I know someone that met with him closely. A good friend of mine met with MBS on his like $300 million yacht in Saudi Arabia. And his views on Israel are unbelievably, surprising and moderate. And so I think that, really what it says is how sad the Palestinian leadership is, because what you're seeing is the whole Arab world move past the Palestinians. They have weak, corrupt leadership, the Palestinians. And what you're seeing is the Arab world needs to move forward, and they don't have time to wait for the Palestinian leadership to get their act together. And so they're increasingly engaging in Israel. They know Israel's not a threat. They know Israel has no regional aspirations to take over their land. And so you're seeing a higher and higher engagement with Israel, and a higher and higher disregard for the Palestinian cause. And if you extrapolate it out 5 years, I think you're going to see the Palestinians, hopefully come to the realization that they've just been, completely, taken advantage of by their leadership, their cause. So, but yeah, there's no doubt a lot of cooperation.
Thank you.
I have a question. This is Catherine.
Go for it, Catherine.
How do you see the Russian involvement?
Well, listen, Russian has come in and filled a lot of the power gap that the U.S. left in the Middle East. I mean, you just have to. I mean, Russia controls a large amount of airspace in Syria. It is dancing on the head of a pin. Every time you see, a reported attack by Israel in Syria, which is critical to maintain Israel's defense. I mean, you got to think about what's entailed in carrying out these attacks. There are Russian airplanes all over the Syrian skies. There are Russian advanced anti-missile air defense systems that have been provided to Syria that are being manned by Russians, so Israel can't necessarily retaliate against them to kill Russians. And so Russia is done a phenomenal job of playing Russia is a master, and Putin is a master of playing a weak hand with maximum leverage. The economy is weak. The military isn't even that strong, but they've worked themselves into a situation where they have a tremendous amount of leverage and power in the Middle East. And so, Israel can't afford to confront Russia, and has to work. It is forced to work very, very closely with Russia. If Israel wants to assert its domination or assert its right to defend itself by attacking, targets throughout the Middle East, it needs the cooperation and the close relationship with Russia. And that's a striking statement. That could not have necessarily been said 10 years ago. But it's the situation that it is now. And the U.S. has withdrawn from the Middle East militarily, and Russia has filled that void. So that's what we got to deal with.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. I mean, I'm happy to answer any questions. I have no time restrictions. But I think, you know, first of all, I hope everyone on the call is safe. I know that I'm very concerned about my parents in San Diego, and I hope everyone is safe. I can tell you that I have family in London, and for some reason, the Jewish community has been hit disproportionately hard by this virus, and the Jewish community in London specifically has been decimated, has been really decimated. And so I think we should all just sort of think about that a little bit. It's another world in London. I suspect that it's because it's a very tight-knit community, very tight-knit. Jews are very close. I mean, I have close family in London. I was actually there in November for a bar mitzvah. Both of my first cousins in London that are 48 and 50 years old, they both had corona, and their kids had corona. And, you know, my one cousin had a tough time with it, but came through it after 9, didn't go to hospital, stayed at home, but came through it after 9 or 10 days. And I spoke to him, and he just said, Mark, you will not believe how many sick people there are in London, you know, with corona. He said, you will not, every single Jewish household he knows has someone that's sick with it. And believe it or not, my brother-in-law's brother is actually the manager at the Jewish cemetery in London, the largest Jewish cemetery. And it's brutal. It's brutal what he's doing. He's unfortunately working day and night. I think that community overall that Jewish community has been decimated tremendously. I read something today, the tiny Jewish community in Morocco that's left there has also been hit very hard. And so I think it has to do with obviously a lot of factors, but you know, Jews are a very tight-knit community. Synagogues are a problem that they're spreading in synagogues, Purim, you know, Seder and stuff like that. So as Jews, I think we like to be together. We like being around family, but we got to buckle down for another, you know, short while, whether it's a month or so. I know it seems like a long time, but we got to buckle down and make sure that this doesn't take a disproportionate toll on us or any toll on us, and just stay safe. I know it's very, very hard to be away from family. Very hard. Anyone else have any questions? Because that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. But I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, as long as I'm still on. Is this is the London Jewish community mostly Orthodox or not?
No, it's not
they?
not mostly. I mean, my one cousin is Orthodox, very modern Orthodox, not Haredi, and my other cousin is just secular. And listen, London's been hit hard overall, right? I mean, because they're taking a much different tact to the rest of the world. I think in the beginning they wanted to let it run itself out in London, and then obviously once it became clear that the virus was so contagious and so forth, they changed tack. So London overall is hit hard, but the Jewish community in London is an amazing community because it's so tight knit. Everyone really lives in these Jewish neighborhoods and gets together. And so, you know, in San Diego, even where my house is in San Diego, I don't live in a Jewish neighborhood. I live in La Jolla. There's no Jews, you know, I got to drive, you know, 10, 15 minutes to go, you know, to see friends or family. It's not that way in London. Everyone's very tight-knit and close and on top of each other, and synagogues. And it's like how I grew up in South Africa. It's a very traditional community. So even if you're not Orthodox, you're still getting together.
Yeah, but I asked that question because obviously the biggest Jewish communities in New York and in Israel that were hit were the Orthodox communities, both in New York and in Israel.
You
so
know,
that's why
I think there's no doubt that the Orthodox community has been hit hard, no doubt. But I think it's a little bit of a misnomer. I mean, my wife's family, her brother's a doctor in New York treating, you know, COVID patients. And there's her his husband, his wife is his doctor as well. And so, I mean, I think these are the hot pockets that are left, you know, the ultra-Orthodox community. But, you know, the one thing that's going to come out is that everyone's got it. I mean, I was in New York at the end of February for a trade show. And, I mean, I can't see how I didn't get it there. I shook 100 hands. I went in, you know, 20 Ubers. And, I mean, I must have had it. I mean, I hope I had it, you know, at this point, you know. So, you know, so it's like, so I think these are just the communities that are the hot spots right now. That everything's been gone, but I think a lot of people have had it.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Mark, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Who is this?
Okay, you can't see me because I'm on my tablet. But
Okay.
you mentioned Morocco. I was just there, got home the end of November. So what's going on in Morocco? You said there's.
I just heard that, you know, that you know, Jews are making up something, it wasn't a long article, that Jews are making up something like 10 to 13% of the deaths in Morocco, but they make up a fraction of the population.
Right.
So, you know, so it's you know, I don't know how widespread it is. That's literally the only thing I know. I don't know how widespread it is there. But, you know, really, you have to remember that just because there are no cases reported doesn't mean it's not there. This is going to be everywhere. It's like saying there's no flu in the world. You know, I know this is more dangerous than flu. You know, the only thing that tells us that there's cases there is testing. And if you're not testing, you don't know who, you know, how many people have it, you know. So, I just know that I read an article today that I thought was interesting, that the Jewish community overall is really taking a disproportional hit. And obviously it's because we like, I don't know if it's obviously, but it's because we like getting together, and because we, you know, we're a traditional community, and we love being together for Shabbats every Friday night, or Shabbat lunch on Saturday, or going to shul, or Purim and the holidays and all that stuff. And this is actually a time of year where some of that stuff is going on, you know, between Seder and Purim and so forth, and travel and spring break and so forth. So
Yeah.
I think that's
Thank you.
one of the things.
Thank you. Yeah.
Mark, I had a question. I've read that Palestinian leadership seems to be pessimistic about neutrality of the United States and brokering a peace deal, and overall pessimistic about the peace deal just being agreed upon. So there are some talks about them kind of giving up their any claim to any sort of land, and instead, you know, basically saying Israel controls all this land, and then they are then going to become Israeli citizens and would then wage a sort of civil rights campaign. Just want to know if you've heard of that, and how would Israel react to that kind of turn of events?
Yeah, so that's the ultimate threat against Israel. The ultimate threat against Israel is basically a binational state, right? So the Palestinians will say, listen, if we can't get an agreement with Israel, we're just going to ask for one thing, and that thing is the right to vote, you know. And we're going to say, listen, we don't want a Palestinian state. We want to be a part of, you know, Israel and a binational state, you know, one state, two countries, two people. And we want the right to vote. And that's been a threat to Israel. And, you know, why is that a threat? Is because, you know, it's the perception of it that's not unreasonable. Think about it. We want the right to vote. It's a democracy. You know, we don't want land. We don't want a country. We just want to be part of, you know, Israel and the right to vote, a binational state. One state for two people, not two states for two people. That's the ultimate threat, you know, for Israel. The problem with that is, one, the two people don't want that, okay? The Palestinians, the majority of the people want their independence. They don't want to be part of Israel. Obviously, the opposite is true. And the main reason is the Palestinian leadership is corrupt. They are complete, they've institutionalized the Palestinian cause. So they get tremendous aid from the West. They get this prestige. They get people fighting for them all around the world and so forth. And so if you go, that might be a great threat to do that, to just go nuclear and blow it up. But then they're going to be killing themselves, right? I mean, then they're done. Then the whole enterprise is done. So unfortunately, the status quo is in the best personal interests of the Palestinian leadership right now. They, you know, Abu Mazen, who's the leader of the Palestinian, yes, he's moderate, and yes, he's better than Arafat in a lot of ways, but the guy is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He's not in the business of creating countries and solving problems. He's at this point, he's pretty much proven to be in the business of perpetuating the problem, not solving it. And so, you know, I don't think he's going to shoot himself in the foot and say, listen, this is it. You know, we're going to just, I'm going to sell to the Palestinian people that they should be part of Israel. You know, he's not going to do that. It's suicide. It's against his interests. So that's always been the case. So the Palestinians will always say, the first thing they'll say is that they are going to withdraw from the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords obviously recognized Israel and recognized the whole concept of land for peace and so forth and so forth. So, you know, that's always what they say. And then they say that they're going to break off security ties with Israel. So believe it or not, the West Bank functions. You know, Gaza doesn't function because it's controlled by Hamas. And Hamas is a terrorist organization, not an administrator or a government. So Hamas is a mess, but the West Bank functions. It has an economy. Unfortunately, it depends on international aid, but it has an economy, and it has relative security. And there are relations with Israel, and those relations are mainly security relations, meaning there are cooperation between the Palestinians and the Israeli security forces. And that keeps basically the wheels on the bus. And Abu Mazen has said, he's repeatedly said, we're breaking off security ties with Israel. But really all he's doing is just shooting himself in the foot, you know. It's gonna cause chaos. Whether he likes to admit it or not, Israel is you know, allowing his administration to survive, and so forth. And so, yeah, that's always been the long-running sort of cycle of threats with Israel, has been to break off the Oslo Accords, break off security relationship, and then say we just want a binational state. But in the end, it's not. You know, neither of the populations would find that acceptable.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What if they're talking about the Jordan Valley becoming part of Israel? Isn't that part of this thing, being one country for two people?
Well, the Jordan Valley is not really a tough solution to solve. It's not, you know, there's not a large amount of population in the Jordan Valley. And I think that right now, as it stands, the Jordan Valley, Israel views the Jordan Valley as part of Israel. It's something that it cannot give up. And the reason it can't give it up is not because it's there's you know 200,000 Jews that live there. It's simply the buffer between Jordan and Israel, right? And Jordan is the buffer between Iraq and Israel, right? So if there's no Jordan Valley and Israel can't have the army in the Jordan Valley, then basically, in theory, it's not a far-fetched scenario where the government of Iraq could fall and a force could just march right from Iraq through Jordan and right into Israel, you know? And so the Jordan Valley is the first line of defense towards the east. And Jordan itself is not exactly the strongest country in the world. They're not the most stable country in the world. So it is really not that far-fetched of a scenario to see Jordan and Iraq be destabilized, and all of a sudden there's one continuous runway from Iran to Iraq to Jordan to Israel that comes right into our country. So I think given the security situation at this point, there's no way any Israeli government, whether it's Benny Gantz or Bibi Netanyahu, would give up the Jordan Valley. Even the most generous peace offering that was extended to the Palestinians under Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak still had Israel maintaining control of the Jordan Valley for like 10 years, assuming the situation stabilized and all these other things happened, then it would hand it over. But the Jordan Valley is one of the, I mean, it's obviously a tough problem to solve, but compared to Jerusalem and right of return and all this stuff, it's a straightforward problem to solve, and Israel just can't afford to give up control of it at this point. This is one of the biggest sticking points also between the coalition negotiation between Bibi Netanyahu and Benny Gantz. You know, because President Trump is so favorable to Israel's requests and for Israel's situation, Bibi Netanyahu views this as a good time to get the American support to annex the Jordan Valley, meaning just make it part of Israel. You know, this is no time to negotiate over these things. And, you know, Benny Gantz thinks it should be done, obviously, an agreement on the Jordan Valley should be done not unilaterally, should be done, through some sort of a larger framework. And so this is what they're talking about. And this is one of the things they're discussing.